Thank you, Deb. I appreciate that. Yeah, so I just want to note that this opening title page is meant as a small tribute to Matt Gertner. He picked this graphic out for me last year as part of my announcement of presidential initiatives, and so I wanted to use this in his honor, and so I just want to say, Matt, I wish you were here to see this. It does seem weird to be, thanking, acknowledging. Like, I have to say that in a lot of ways, I feel like my career is just starting. It's sort of early for me to be thanking, acknowledging people. I still feel like this young person up here starting his career. But it's a really good opportunity to show gratitude to the people that are important. And I have to start with my family. I really need to thank my family. First, I wanted to say my son, Lucas, who's grown into a young man before my eyes over the past 18 years, and who always reminds me that life can be chaotic and unpredictable. But if a good song comes on the radio, sometimes it's best to belt out the lyrics, even if you have to make them up on the fly. To my wife and partner, Whitney, when people use the term, how's your better half, it's really not figurative in my case. I also want to thank my parents, Ray and Sylvia, who always supported me, and in particular my mother, who has always reminded me in big ways and small ways that details matter and little things add up. And just, thanks to so many. I have to thank Mark Wilson, who's here in front, and Paul Holland, who's not with us, but I'm sure everybody knows. And also David Friedman, who probably a lot of you don't know, but if you had a chance, look up the paper, Statistics in Shoe Leather, and you'll learn a lot by David Friedman. I need to thank my colleagues at CU Boulder through the years, how much I've benefited from experiences with you and learning from you and being engaged with you. My students are maybe my greatest source of professional pride. Like, there's just nothing that I do as a professional that makes me happier than seeing my students successful. Just the idea that I can play a small part in their professional and personal success in life is the thing that makes me the happiest, I have to say. And so I thank my students for any role I get to play in their lives and the friendships that we've gotten to share together. And I want to just thank this community, NCME, and not just this NCME community, but also just the educational research community. I've gotten to meet so many great people, like really, really insightful people that have become my friends and in this professional community, and I've missed you so much over the last 2 years. I'm just so grateful to be able to see you again today. Now, for the past 10 years or so, I've spent a considerable amount of time studying and doing my best to learn not only the history of our field, but about the concepts and controversies that have helped to define it. Figuratively, the pages I've turned have been in the backward direction. The book I published last November was one culminating result. But in this talk, I want to start contemplating what it will mean to turn the page forward as we collectively write the next chapters of educational measurement. In doing so, I'm going to place special focus on what I think educational measurement should entail, which is not always the same thing as what it actually does entail. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's all fine and good. So what I want to do is, in advance, I just want to acknowledge that there's a really good chance that I'm going to try to do too much in this talk. And by the time we get to 40 minutes, you might be thinking about getting your drinks. And so I want to hit you with the theme of this talk in advance so you know what to expect. My theme for this talk is that measurement in education is a valuable and worthy aspiration, but it should be practiced with humility and in moderation. Okay? Now, you might be saying, well, okay, fine, but why are you calling measurement an aspiration? Isn't that what we all do? And who are you to be talking about humility and moderation, you of running over people playing soccer? But bear with me, bear with me. We should start with where we find ourselves today. We find ourselves in what feels like an important moment in history brought on by features of the world that can seem beyond our means to control: the COVID-19 pandemic, the costs and consequences of war, climate change, and the visceral signs and reminders of social justice and economic inequality. As Matt Gertner once said, the last few years have not taken it easy on any of us. As overwhelming as this all can feel, the place that I turn for comfort is education. I believe that individuals can change the world, and education can change the individual. I still believe that education can light the fire. And the question I keep asking myself about is this: what role can and should education measurement play in making the world a better place? But before I can turn the page forward, I want to turn it backward, actually, to the 1920s, because roughly a century ago, people were asking these very same questions at a time when educational measurement, as a field of both study and practice, was just coming into existence. What lessons can we learn from this history? In 1918, a new influenza virus had emerged at the same time that World War I was nearing its end. The pandemic came in 3 waves, a first in the spring of 1918, a second in the fall as the war came to an end, and a third in the winter, and the spring of 1919 finally subsiding in the summer. The vulnerability of healthy young adults and the lack of vaccines and treatments created a major public health crisis, with at least 50 million deaths worldwide, including approximately 775,000 in the United States. And just to put this in perspective, the current cumulative number of deaths from COVID is about 0.3% of the US population. The proportion of Americans who died from the Spanish flu is twice this size. But just as the pandemic was subsiding, social unrest was increasing, prompted in part by a resurgence in violence in the South as black servicemen returned from World War I to face the specter of Jim Crow laws. The term Red Summer was coined by civil rights activist and author James Weldon Johnson. Johnson used the term Red Summer to characterize the events that were taking place between April and November of 1919. These events included approximately 25 riots and instances of mob violence, often initiated by white servicemen who had returned from World War I, 97 recorded lynchings, and a 3-day-long massacre in Elaine, Arkansas, during which over 200 black men, women, and children were killed after black sharecroppers tried to organize for better working conditions. This was 2 years before the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, one of the worst episodes of racial violence in American history. The 1920s were a time of significant immigration and population growth in the United States, and this was accompanied by increasing economic anxiety and xenophobia, which manifested itself in the Federal Immigration Act of 1924, and a groundswell of support for state by state for policies premised on eugenics. There was then, just as there is now, a belief that technological innovation could be leveraged to enhance the educational experiences and life outcomes of children and young adults at a time when universal requirements for public education were becoming more and more widespread, not only in the United States, but in the world. In the 1920s, the innovation was the standardized test instrument. In the 2020s, the innovation might be loosely cast as the increased integration of portable and digitally connected environments and information into dated everyday life. These were and are indeed legitimate technological innovations, and both offered the potential to help in meeting the educational challenges of the era. One common thread between the two might be the utopian premise that measurement is the key to scientific advance, not just in the physical sciences, but in education. At the time, a relatively small cadre of educational psychologists helped to popularize the idea that testing and measurement were one and the same thing. To a large extent, I think that those who work in the field of educational measurement are still guilty of this today. And in that we can be rather, in the sense I mean by that is that we can be rather casual in using the terms testing, assessment, and measurement synonymously. But it is only the term measurement that is featured in the name of this organization. We are the National Council on Measurement in Education. So it seems important to me that we continue to grapple with what we think it means to do measurement in education and with what a commitment to measurement entails. Now, the diagram I'm showing here represents an idea that's been developed in collaboration with my colleagues Josh McGrain and Andy Mall. It's meant to reflect a shared contention that the measurement of an educational or psychological construct, or you could use the word attribute, but I'll use the word construct because it's more familiar in this audience, necessarily involves 4 related aspects. These aspects, I would argue, were central to measurement in the 1920s, and they remain central to measurement in the 2020s. Starting from the left, here are some of the main questions that the body of knowledge relevant to each aspect requires us to pose when we aspire to measure. First, I'll start with theory. What assumptions are being made in establishing a construct that is measurable? And on what grounds are these assumptions defensible? Can we articulate a theory to explain why individuals vary with respect to their standing on the construct? How will the theory be amenable to empirical investigation? Instrumentation. What set of tasks can we devise for the purpose of eliciting this variability amongst the objects of measurement? How will we evaluate whether the tasks accomplish this successfully? Scales and units. How will we establish a scale and unit of measurement such that the differences in measurements can be meaningfully interpreted, compared, and generalized? And modeling. How do we establish that there is a correspondence between the numeric values of our scale and the construct of measurement? How do we characterize uncertainty in our measurements caused by errors of observation and weakness in our theoretical understanding of the construct? Educational measurement, in my view, sits within the interaction of these four central aspects. These interactions are always implicit when a claim of measurement is being advanced, but the key question is whether they are being attended to purposefully and whether they are attended to coherently and comprehensively. Now, if I had the time and energy, and if you had the energy and willingness to listen to a 2-hour talk, I would spend the next 30 minutes talking about, maybe 60 minutes, talking about the debates and arguments that were taking place between 1904 and 1930 as Alfred Binet, Charles Spearman, Godfrey Thompson, and Louis Thurstone, among others, were doing work and having debates about the measurement of intelligence. It was in this context that so many of the foundational building blocks that are still actually at the heart of educational measurement were being introduced. And notably, these included Binet's attempts to link an evolving theory of intelligence and its relationship to age into an approach for test design and analysis. And you can see where I've placed that interaction there in the interaction between those two pieces, which I call the theory by instrumentation interaction. The challenge of defining measurement units that blur the boundary between normative and criterion reference interpretation. Spearman's debate with Thurstone and Thompson over different theories about cognitive abilities and the extent to which such debates can be settled empirically. Thurstone's demonstration in 1925 that what people thought they knew about the development of intelligence through adolescence into adulthood was contingent upon the approach that was being taken to establish the unit for the scale of measurement. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the time to get into all of these details because I've promised myself and others that today I will spend more time looking forward than backward. These stories are for another time, and if I've at least piqued your interest, I hope you will explore them in my book, where I do go into them in quite a bit of detail. But I do want to make a few important points. The giants of the early 20th century, the pioneers of psychometrics, all knew that relative to the measurement practice in the physical sciences, that what was being done when it came to the measurement of intelligence in the 1920s was measurement with a big asterisk. They justified it rather loosely on the following pragmatic grounds: that the decisions that could be made through the use of a test score, a putative measure of cognitive ability, would be more objective, rational, and efficient than the decisions that would be made in the absence of the test score. You can see this in the two quotations I've included on this slide. The one on the left comes from Binet after he had developed the initial Binet-Simon measuring scale for intelligence in 1905. And you can see in this quote how he's essentially admitting and saying, listen, I know what measurement is in the physical science. That's not really what we're doing here, because really intelligence is not something that can be superimposed and it's not additive. But by 3 years later, after he'd released a revision to the scale in 1908, he'd adopted a slightly different tone. He writes here, the measurement of intelligence is perhaps the most oft-repeated expression in psychology during these last few years. Some psychologists affirm that intelligence can be measured. Others declare that it is impossible to measure intelligence. But there are still others better informed who ignore these theoretical discussions and apply themselves to the actual solving of the problem. What was largely missing, in my view, from the debates of the day was any real debate over the meaning of measurement in psychology outside of this pragmatic justification. There was no attempt to bring together the four critical aspects I've identified here as a guiding framework. I think if this had been done, it would have been much clearer how far away the field was from having test scores that could be given valid interpretations as measures of intelligence. The explosion of educational and psychological testing in the 1920s and the purposes for which they were used does not make for a great origin story for the testing industry. While it was not the case that intelligence and achievement testing itself was the cause of the considerable racism, sexism, and xenophobia that characterized policies and practices of this era, there are clear and prominent instances in which intelligence tests, in particular, were complicit in serving to maintain and perpetuate racism, sexism, and xenophobia. Much of this was famously documented in Stephen Jay Gould's 1981 book, The Mismeasure of Man, which is shown in the middle of this slide. The book tells the story of a technological innovation, the individual and group administered standardized test, and how this was taken up as a key tool for the promotion of eugenics as a motivating objective for social policy. The charges against some of the leading educational psychologists of the time, Henry Goddard, Lewis Terman, Robert Yerkes, and Carl Brigham, are twofold. First, that they were guilty of conflating, reifying, the construct they sought to measure with the instrumental procedure they had designed to measure it. Second, that they had popularized biological explanations for interindividual differences that were both atheoretical and based on bad data. The two clearest examples of this scientific racism of the era were the two books shown on the left and right of this slide by Carl Brigham and Lewis Terman. It was not just that they had found data from tests and found differences in means by the racial ethnic groupings of young adults in Brigham's case and in children in Terman's case. It was that they had purportedly measured these group differences. It was the terminology of measurement that dressed up a questionable analysis of test scores with the prestige and authority that a claim of measurement implied. This was, by the way, already recognized by quite a lot, many of the in psychology at the time who were critical of intelligence testing. As Edwin Boring wrote, one of the grand patriarchs of sort of psychology of that time, seriously, our mental testers are wasting a glorious amount of energy on figuring out results that don't mean a damn thing when they are gotten. To put this as clearly as I can, testing and educational measurement are not the same thing. In my view, testing is primarily a procedural activity, while educational measurement is an aspirational activity. This is not to diminish in any way the importance of testing as a form of instrumentation that may well be a necessary means to the end of educational measurement. But while instrumentation is necessary for measurement, it is not sufficient. Anytime we forget this, we create the same potential to repeat the mistakes of our past. So let's go back to the 2020s. A lot has changed in 100 years, so let's start thinking about the future. The two charts on this slide tell us what we surely know, but may not fully always appreciate, and that is just how dramatically the racial ethnic demographics of this country have changed. The chart on the left shows that the percentage of students taking the long-term NAEP tests have changed in racial ethnic self-identification from 1978 to 2020, with the percentage identifying as white decreasing from 80% to 46%, and the percentage identifying as Hispanic increasing from 6 to 26. The chart on the right shows a projection 38 years from today in which the percentage of white children in the U.S. will drop from 51 to 36%, still the plurality, but hardly the majority. So where does the field of educational measurement, and by extension, the NCME community, sit today? Are the four conceptual aspects of educational measurement that I've identified still relevant to us today? And in what sense and how can measurement matter as a tool for the betterment of society and the pursuit of social justice? I want to start by noting something that we need to appreciate that was surely not appreciated 100 years ago, and that is that educational measurement is just one small piece nested within a much bigger societal puzzle. The starting point, in my view, here is education and the role that we expect education to play in society. This is in itself a question for which there can be no single agreed-upon answer, and indeed the answer we give may change due to the changing influence of politics, the law, economics, culture, values, and history. Education is a multidisciplinary field, and one need only peruse the program of the AERA conference that surrounds us here in San Diego to appreciate there are many issues in educational research and practice that do not involve measurement. Now, in most countries, the formal public interface we have with education comes in the exposure children have to teaching and learning in school and classroom settings. Assessment sits at the intersection between teaching and learning, and it also need not entail measurement. To be clear, I define assessment as the evaluation or estimation of the nature, quality, or ability of someone or something. It requires the rendering of a judgment, but while this generally requires theory and instrumentation, two of the aspects I showed before for educational measurement, it does not require a numeric scale or a formal characterization of uncertainty. In other words, assessment can be done without recourse to numeric quantification. The last circle in the diagram represents the focal point of my attention today, educational measurement. It is important, I think, to remember that one of the primary reasons we have historically sought to measure educational and psychological constructs is to evaluate change and connect this change to inferences about teaching and learning. I think we at NCME sometimes forget about this important role we have to play in the educational research ecosystem. But whether we play this role as well as we could, and whether the role we play needs to change, is something that many in our community have begun to question over the past few years. And as we turn the page to write the next chapter of educational measurement, I think we're going to have to work harder to clarify for ourselves and for the public just what it is that this enterprise entails and what it is that makes it valuable. To accomplish this, I want to argue that we will need to bring together the members of 4 different affinity groups: testing specialists, computational psychometricians, classroom assessment specialists, critical theorists, and philosophers of science. I won't have time to go into as much detail about each group as I would like, and I will notice that there's often overlap among groups, but I will provide some distinguishing features I see of each one and what I think these features have to contribute to coherently and comprehensively understanding educational measurement. The testing specialist affinity group is surely the one that encompasses the largest number of NCME members. The standards for educational and psychological testing is a Bible of sorts for this group. Even if few members have ever read it from cover to cover, they appreciate that it represents a consensus with regard to evolving notions of best practices. Most members have at least passing familiarity with classical test theory, item response theory as tools for solving the challenges that arise in large-scale testing contexts. And there's also, in some sense, like a adjacent affinity group to testing specialists, and it's like those are the users of test results for doing things like growth modeling and interpreting evaluation effects. I say this because I see Damien here in front of me and I can't sort of ignore him in this. Testing specialists play an important role in educational measurement because they are most concerned with tests as instruments of measurement, and they thus focus on the interactions of a given test instrument with the scales and units through which test scores are to be reported, the mathematical approach that is being used to establish and maintain the scale, and the model being used to quantify uncertainty along the scale due to measurement error. Testing specialists tend to have unique specializations. They often form micro-communities that establish operational paradigms for activities such as linking and equating, computer adaptive testing, standard setting, establishing test alignment, testing for special populations, etc. A benefit of these micro-communities is that new entrants to the community can rather quickly learn the rules and conventional operating procedures. A possible weakness is that these rules and paradigms can become constraints to innovation. That is, I think more than any of the other groups I'm going to describe today, testing specialists tend to be reactive, as they often operate under the constraints of federal or state policies and the wishes of their clients. Testing specialists are the ones who can point to the design, analysis, and maintenance of high-quality, large-scale testing programs in the US, like NAEP, the Smarter Balance Consortium, Dynamic Learning Maps, and the Multi-State Alternate Assessment, WIDA, and ELPA 21. Point to these as all success stories. Because these testing programs exist, researchers have the ability to quantify the size of the pandemic effect on student learning and to monitor and evaluate efforts to help students recover. But testing specialists, if they're being honest with themselves, and I play this role as well when I serve on a TAC, have to admit that sometimes they have to feel a little bit like a character in the movie Groundhog Day. And not really Bill Murray in this case, who finds a way of self-betterment to break out of the time loop, but more like Needle-Nosed Ned, who keeps trying to sell the same insurance policy day in, day out, with people running in the opposite direction as soon as they see him approaching. And there's this sense kind of, it's like, you know, if you sit on TACs and if you sit in these state programs, like, you're just often repeating the same thing and not really feeling like the theory of action is leading to some betterment, social betterment, reducing of inequality. So it has to be that we're at this time as testing specialists asking ourselves questions about the larger role that we play. The second group, computational psychometricians, I take this term, computational psychometrics, as a term that Alina von Davier coined in 2015 to refer to the blending of computational techniques like data mining, natural language processing, and machine learning with traditional psychometric theory in the service of student assessment with multimodal data that can be produced within a digital learning environment. Those in this group tend to want to focus on the so-called 21st century skills, creativity, communication, collaborative problem solving, and to do this in a digital learning environment. A valuable thing I think that Von Davier, Misslevy, and Howe in their book are attempting to foster is a field of practice in which the folks with mostly computer science, statistics, and engineering backgrounds can learn some psychometrics and ECD and vice versa. Computational psychometrics is put in place to support assessment as something embedded within a personalized learning experience, and it, in a sense, operates behind the scenes to facilitate an adaptive and sometimes gamified experience in which student is placed in a position where it's the student seeking out assessment opportunities rather than having them be imposed externally. Now, I just want to give a shout out to a separate, kind of adjacent also affinity group, and this is our friends in quantitative psychology. And just as one example of some methodological advances that are happening over there is a great deal of energy and enthusiasm around network psychometrics. There's just this recent special issue that came out in Psychometrica. And I just say this because here, this is a case where they had this methodology, and I don't know if it would actually have some applications that we can work in educational measurement, but it might. And they're doing some really interesting thing where they're actually trying to have theory inspire model rather than the other way around. And I'm really encouraged by sort of the energy that's happening there, and I think that's another place where we need to reach out and create connections between the work that's happening with educational measurers and psychometricians. The aspects of educational measurement that hold the greatest allure to the computational psychometricians clearly, though, come in the interactions between mathematical models, instrumentation, and theory. The computational psychometricians overlap with the test specialists in their focus on the data to model connection, but they've opened the door to a much wider array of data. Furthermore, because they're not operating usually under the constraints of federal accountability testing policies, and because they aren't especially concerned about measuring learning outcomes as much as producing them, they can be much more flexible in the models that they employ. Now, the third group is the one I've actually had the hardest time labeling. I've chosen classroom assessment specialists because the defining shared characteristic for this group is the belief in the power and promise of formative assessment practices as a tool for learning. This is a belief surely endorsed by test specialists and computational psychometricians as well, but for this group, a distinguishing feature is the importance of social interaction and cultural values, something it is the responsibility of a human being, the teacher, to coordinate and mediate within a physical setting, which I refer to here loosely as the classroom. To many classroom assessment specialists, the term test conjures up unappealing associations with summative assessment of learning. It may also evoke the image of a set of selected response and short constructed response items designed for efficiency, designed to locate students in some underlying normal distribution. Because the terminology of testing and educational measurement has become so entangled, there is a real distinction to be made between educational assessment and educational measurement. In a classroom setting, teachers make assessments about their students all the time. If these sorts of classroom activities promote learning, then it might seem the question of whether the information it elicited from the assessment, whether it can be converted into a quantitative measure, might seem beside the point. If the Bible for testing specialists is the standards, then we might say the scripture for classroom assessment can be found in the consensus reports and the references they contain about learning theory found in these 3 National Academy of Sciences reports. How students learn and knowing what students know emphasize what we might describe as a socio-cognitive perspective on learning. Attention is given to the salient differences between experts and novices in the way they chunk and retrieve information and concepts into schema. The important role of scaffolding for novice learners, and the challenges of transfer and generalization. Evidence-centered design, principled assessment design, construct modeling, learning progressions, in some ways all represent an appreciation that underlying any assessment, irrespective of scale, is some implicit model or theory about how students learn. What I think has changed in recent years, culminating with the release of How People Learn Too, is an expansion from socio-cognitive theories of learning to socio-cultural theories of learning. It's certainly not new to say that learning is contingent upon motivation and engagement, but we have increasing research over the past 3 decades suggesting that it may be well more important than we realized. In particular, we know that motivation and engagement and a host of cognitive resources can be enhanced when the curriculum and assessment that students experience is culturally relevant and Interesting. Students of all ages bring with them experiences, intuitions, and values, the so-called funds of knowledge, only jargon I'm going to use in this talk, that a teacher and a school can use to tailor and organize assessment activities and targeted feedback. So the aspects of measurement that are at the heart of all classroom assessment specialists is the use of learning theories to design good assessment activities, and such activities may or may not contain the restrictive item formats or the degree of standardization we associate with tests. But I would say that there's a tension in this group about the role and importance of measurement, specifically the value of placing assessment responses onto a numeric scale and the modeling of responses to quantify uncertainty. At the crux of this tension is the quality of feedback that is possible when students are given an externally developed standardized test comprised of multiple choice items. These tests tend to be very good at ranking and classifying, but good diagnosis has to go beyond ranking and classifying. If educational measurement is nothing more than testing for the purpose of quantification and grading, then Laurie Shepard is right to tell testing specialists they're doing more harm than good when they do battle over the market for interim assessments. However, if educational measurement is more than this, as I believe, it represents an aspiration to integrate theory, instrumentation, scales and units, and modeling, then I would argue with Laurie and others that it can have a role to play in classroom assessment. From my own experiences in this space, it is often much easier to develop what you think is a high-quality assessment activity until you actually have to decide how to score and differentiate the quality of the responses. This is an interaction that brings theory and instrumentation in contact with scales and units. And surely the concepts of uncertainty, errors of observation, and limits on generalization, concepts that I think are central to the modeling interactions of educational measurement, are ones that teachers need to keep at the very least in the backs of their minds, if not the forefront. Last but not least, we have a group that forces us to question the entire value proposition of educational measurement. In numerous publications over the past 25 years, Joel Michel has advanced the compelling argument that the foundation of educational measurement is a quantity hypothesis that has been presumed but never seriously investigated. That is, why do we start from the assumption that individuals can be located on a continuum with properties of a real number line? As far as Michel is concerned, there is just one definition of measurement, and it has no asterisk. As long as we claim to accomplish it by fiat, we have yet to truly internalize the lessons from the misuse of mental testing that began over a century ago. Now, David Sherry has offered what I consider to be the sharpest response to Michel's critique, and he suggests an alternative pragmatic perspective. Other thoughtful responses to this critique can be seen in the recent books by David Torres Ibarra and by Mari, Wilson, and Moll. More recently, coming from a different perspective, rooted in critical race theory, Jennifer Randall and others have argued that so long as educational measurement exists within a traditional paradigm that perpetuates systemic racism, it will continue to do so unless and until an active approach is taken to disrupt the paradigm. To act on this critique might include a rethinking of the ways that constructs have been historically defined and conceptualized, and it surely requires greater attention to the power imbalance between those who measure and those who are measured. Between them, these critiques of educational measurement tend to focus attention on the interaction between the theory for the construct of measurement as it interacts with test and assessment design, the evaluation of scales and units, and the mathematical modeling of student responses. But perhaps most importantly, these sorts of critiques, especially when they are delivered by people who may see themselves as outsiders to the testing and assessment industry, are especially valuable because they force us from a tendency towards insularity. They remind us that the plane upon which educational assessment and measurement sits is one that has to be sensitive to the lessons from history, as well as the changes to the societal values and culture. In turn, we need to be cognizant of the way these changes can be constrained or enhanced by economic conditions, political conditions, and power and the law. In my view, it is the insights that can accumulate when all these groups interact and debate that gives us the possibility of a coherent and comprehensive approach to educational measurement, one in which we are seeing the whole board, recognizing the whole big picture. And that's what I think we need to do as a field, see the whole board. As we turn this page, here are some things I regard as subjects that are going to require some attention, discussion, and debate. My title for this slide was actually going to be "Don't Leave Me Brokenhearted." Almost 100 years ago, Thurstone demonstrated that inferences about the growth and variability of intelligence by age could fundamentally change depending upon the unit of measurement. He also showed the way that item mapping could provide anchor points for making sense of magnitudes. I think Thurstone would have expected us to make more progress on this than we have. And educational researchers are always surprised to find that we don't have much in the way of alternatives to propose beyond weeks and months of learning as ways of characterizing magnitude and differences. This has been an active area of research for me, and I don't have time to go into all the details here, so I'm going to do the annoying thing and self-reference for those who might want to pick up this thread later, but this has been something that has been a passion of mine for quite some time. Now, we are still very far away from producing measures with scales and units that are well understood that can properly convey differences in amount. It is, in my view, a mild matter of frustration for me that scaling is often viewed as something distinct from measurement. You know, you're just doing scaling. When in my view, the choice of scale requires a strong interaction between theory and instrumentation. And once combined with modeling, we find ourselves with an approach to measurement that achieves full coherence among the four aspects. Scaling should not be separate from measurement. It is fundamental to measurement. Scale properties matter, but we mostly ignore this as a topic for research. Those who use test scores to evaluate group differences with statistical models implicitly assume an interval scale. When they come to us to ask how we would know the difference between an interval or an ordinal scale, we mostly just throw up our hands and shrug. I'm not saying this is an easy issue, as quite likely the best we can do is establish some quasi-interval scale. But educational researchers expect us to be the ones to study it and take it seriously. Hand-waving is not good enough when there really are important questions to be posed about trends in magnitudes. A second caveat I have comes from this graphic, which I have pulled from a recent article that was published in The Atlantic. The graphic is based on a CDC data, and the x-axis shows years from 2009 to 2021, and there's an implicit y-axis here that shows the percent of American high school students indicating that they feel persistently sad or hopeless. And what I want you to notice in looking at these lines is that the trend lines were actually heading upwards before the pandemic started, right? And that these trend lines that are heading in an upward direction, in a very disturbing direction, are all upwards across every group. No matter what group you're looking at, there are differences in level, but they're all heading up. We can see this across gender, sexual, racial, ethnic groups. Again, even before the pandemic started, and you can see even the sharper uptick from 2019 to 2021, which envelopes the pandemic. Now, this is, of course, all correlational, but it really suggests a worry that I have that a shift of learning away from human-to-human interaction toward human-to-avatar interaction might have some very unanticipated consequences on social emotional well-being and mental health. And it's something that those of us that are interested in the advances of computational psychometrics need to appreciate how much that group needs to be working with those in classroom assessment, because it can't be a replacement for the role of the teacher. The last thing, another caveat I have is in us having debates and discussions about what it means to have commitments to fairness and equity. In the National Academy of Sciences report monitoring educational equity, equity is defined as the idea that the distribution of certain goods and services is purposely unequal so that the neediest of students may receive more of certain resources, often to compensate or make up for their different starting points. Inequity refers to situations in which differences in need have not been adequately considered. Although a consensus definition of fairness has proven somewhat elusive, a definition that I have used in my own writing is that an assessment can be considered fair to the extent that it has been successfully designed to maximize the opportunity for all students to demonstrate their capabilities with respect to the construct of measurement. And so a question I pose a little bit open-endedly is whether these mean the same thing, equity and fairness. I kind of don't think they necessarily do. I would argue that educational measurement can and must attend to fairness in their interaction between theory and instrumentation in particular. We should continue to explore assessment and test design principles that can reduce barriers and increase opportunities for all students to demonstrate what they know and can do. In contrast, I think the goal of equity by design, when measurement is a stated goal, is much more controversial and potentially problematic. We know that a great deal of the variability we observe in large-scale assessments is attributable to differences in resources and opportunities to learn, Now, if we could measure such variables, then it would be relatively straightforward modeling activity to redefine an educational construct of measurement as the residual after conditioning on the OTL variable. In fact, this is pretty much what we are doing when we get an estimate of a student's normative growth, for example, through the use of a student growth percentile. To a large extent, I think we have already been down this road over the past 20 years in the context of systems of test-based accountability, growth models, and value-added models. Once you start conditioning, it's hard to know when to stop, and you run the risk of over-adjusting, which can lead to paradoxical results. Measures of growth will be more equitable than measures of status. They will also be far less reliable. 2 years ago, in his presidential address, Steve Cerisi characterized the use of SGPs as hypocritical because, in his view, they do not meet standards for reliability. But I wonder if Steve would adopt the same position in response to those advocating for an equity-oriented approach to educational measurement by taking what Ms. Levy has described, a conditional approach to fairness. I'm not saying there's one right answer to this question, but right now, the role that large-scale assessments have to play when it comes to commitments to educational equity is to help us monitor and evaluate the progress being made by those who are on the front lines of policy and practice seeking to ameliorate inequities. This is still an important role. If we want to go beyond this, it will take more than good intentions, and it will probably mean giving up on something that is a central aspect of educational measurement. And here, I just remember a question a friend posed to me, and it was a serious one. If you have a commitment, tell me what you're willing to give up. What are you willing to give up? There is no free lunch, and it drives me a little bit crazy when people act like we can have it all. So if educational equity is something that is important to you, tell me what you're willing to give up to achieve it. A last caveat is I think we have a fox guarding the henhouse problem. As a community, I think NCME would like to believe that when it comes to educational measurement, there should be a synergy between research and practice. Research should guide practice, and practice should inform research. But what happens when the livelihood and reputation of the researcher becomes entangled with the success of the practice? John Tukey once said, "Far better an approximate answer to the right question, which is often vague, than an exact answer to the wrong question, which can always be made precise." I worry that for too long we've been giving the public relatively precise answers to the wrong question, in part because it would be financially or reputationally problematic to admit that the best we can do, at least in the short run, is to provide approximate answers to questions that we don't yet know how to properly conceptualize. I don't think there's a lot of bandwidth in the testing industry for that kind of uncertainty, and there needs to be if we're going to actually make real progress, in my view. And I could tell a lot of stories about this, but just a few things I just want to mention is that when I was doing my dissertation, I did a dissertation on the effects of coaching on the SAT. And you know, when it got published, it got all kinds of attention in the press, and I was talking to the media. But Don Powers and Don Rock had done a study that was as good as mine a few years ago. It did not get the same attention. I think the reason why, because they're researchers from UTS. And there was a credibility issue of me as a graduate student at a university. There was a perception that I could give this question a fair shake. We have to think about that. We have to think about public perception. We have to think about collaborations between the testing industry and researchers and ways that the testing industry can be more transparent, right? And create opportunities for these kinds of interactions. And the other thing I'll just say is this. There was a wonderful EIP issue about social justice and college admissions. There were sessions today all about that. I'll just say this. One of the things that really struck me in reading the references that were cited in that is how many references were internal reports that had never been submitted for peer review. We got to do better. Like, we got to submit our ideas for criticism and external review, and it can't just disappear. Some of these things not only are only done internally, they're never made available for the public to look at. Okay, toward the next chapter of educational measurement, we're almost there, guys. Did you remember my theme? Do you understand why I have this theme? Here are my 4 challenges to the NCME community. The first is this. I want us to regard measurement as an act of discovery instead of an act of definition. Mark Wilson coined the term constructing measures, which may seem definitional. But the act of construction is not that of following a recipe or a set of instructions. It's about finding out whether the items that we design elicit the variability that was intended, and figuring out a way to get better and better in this endeavor over time. It's programmatic research. That's what we need in this field. We need to understand that a testing program is a start, and we need to learn more about it over time and the constructs that we're trying to measure. We need to think about continuous improvement through programmatic research, and that needs to be a priority in this community. The second is, again, we need to see coherence across the 4 aspects of educational measurement. I've talked about that in some length, and it's really important to think how these things all interact. It's not just instrumentation. It's not just fitting an IRT model. It's the interactions, the model with the theory, with the instrumentation, and the scales and units. Third, we need to beware of the pitfalls of solely pragmatic justifications for testing practices, lest we repeat the mistakes of the 1920s. If you're going to make a pragmatic argument, you're making a commitment to exploring a counterfactual. What is that counterfactual, and how do we make that comparison? It can't just be hand-waving. You know, sometimes we use the quote from George Box that all models are wrong and some are useful. Some models are just wrong. The last thing I want to say is this, and this is something that really cuts to what is my value as a researcher and I think as a human, is I want us to have the courage and willingness to ask why. Just simple. Ask yourself why about what you're doing and keep learning. I hope I never get to a point in my career when a younger person comes to me with a new idea and I think that I don't have to listen because I already know I will always be learning. That's fundamental to me. I'm ready really to wrap up this talk, but I actually switched things a little bit around because I want to dedicate this talk to Laurie Shepard, and I didn't know if Laurie was going to be here at the start, and I see that she's here now. And I want to acknowledge Laurie because throughout my career, Laurie has been my dean, my mentor, my role model, and my friend. And Laurie is and has been for so long a giant in educational research. I'd like to think I'm still pretty young as an NCME president, but you know, Laurie did this when she was just 32, the second female president in NCME's history. I don't need to tell you why Laurie is a giant in the field. If you care about classroom assessment, you know her work. If you care about validity, you know her work. If you care about fairness, you know her work. If you don't care about any of these things, you're in the wrong room. Laurie is quite simply the most impressive person I know. And it's not just because she's brilliant. I want to tell this short story is that when my son Lucas was born, I just started at the faculty on Boulder. Laurie was the first person at our doorstep when we came back from the hospital. And she brought this huge stuffed koala as a gift. And Lucas still keeps that koala on his bed to this day. Laurie has never forgotten that at the end of the day, what we do is all about people and relationships. So what makes Laurie so impressive is not just her brilliance, it's her kindness and it's her integrity. So I would like to just take this moment and acknowledge Laurie Shepard for everything that she does. Gotcha, Laurie. She wouldn't let me organize a big party in Boulder for her, so I had to find some way to give her the due that she deserves. So love you very much. Thank you all for paying attention and listening, and I hope this has been helpful for you. With that, I want to pass the ceremony of the passing of the torch from me to Deb Harris as I assume the most coveted role in all of NCME, past president. Thank you. You're all dismissed.